Welcome to fireside chat here at Accelerace. With me today I have Anneli Bartholdy from Maersk, and the idea of today is have a conversation on corporate innovation, and as part of that, of course, corporate entrepreneurship. Anneli is kind of head of the activities of corporate entrepreneurship in Maersk. Been doing a lot of things so far, but maybe you could introduce yourself, Anneli.
I act tough and big, but I'm not actually the head of corporate innovation. But officially, I guess, I'm right now called Innovation Portfolio Manager within Maersk, and transferring to a new role we're creating in our whole digital strategy recently announced, so going to be working with digital innovation. I've been working with organizational change and innovation on a corporate level within Maersk for about seven and a half years now, which is why I think Peter thinks I'm in charge of it, but there are many wonderful people also doing it, and also I have bosses, so they're the heads of things. But thanks anyway. I could use a, job change.
Exactly.
I didn't know, but thanks. Now I'm promoted.
Yeah, you're promoted inside Maersk.
Yeah.
So Anneli, could you tell us a little bit, as I say, well, this is quite new to Maersk. I think you've been working with this for how long?
Well, like I said, 7.5 years, sort of.
Yeah.
But Maersk's been doing a lot with corporate innovation for a long time, but it's historically been done more on a unit-by-unit level. Mm-hmm. So each business unit or business area, like terminals and line and oil and drilling and so on, have all had their own innovation initiatives, and then there have been some collaborative ones. The last year, in 2016, we've seen a lot more collaboration going across the group. We had a new technical innovation board start late 2015. Mm-hmm. And then now with the restructuring, it's again shifting a little bit on how we're going to approach that. So that's kind of still falling into place.
Okay. And what is the background for that? So what is kind of your motivation for setting this up in a new way internally in Maersk?
Well, I'm sitting now in the transport and logistics side, and the intention with that and setting it up the way it is forming now is really to enable the end-to-end connection between all the units under transport and logistics. So we have the freight forwarders, and we have the terminals, and we have Svitzer, which does port operations and tugboats. And then we have Maersk Line, of course, and Maersk Container Industry. So these are kind of each piece of the chain in that whole transport and logistics area. Yeah. So it's to really try and leverage that interconnectivity.
Okay, fantastic. And kind of the idea of also having as part of this working with startups and building relationships with startups. So what is kind of the idea behind that?
Yeah. So I've been managing Maersk project for the last year, as you guys know, on how Maersk will set up its collaboration with startups. So it was a very exploratory project that we've been running this first year, happily also piloting with Accelerace. And the intention with that was to two things. One, figure out tools, you could say a toolbox of how to find and scout and work with the startup companies, culturally, new technology area-wise, all that sort of thing. So that's the accelerators. We've run some hackathons, and now we're doing more of a hackathon approach to a lot of things and more kind of outside looking. Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, it's looking at the internal structure, which has a lot of interconnectivity with the corporate innovation, right? So what is the structure you need to have in place? How do you enable and support these sorts of activities, and working in a different way, whether it's with a startup or even just on new types of projects than we're used to.
Okay. So kind of when I talk to other corporations, there's quite a lot of kind of measurements and ideas and why they're doing it. So it can be all the way from kind of we want to find new projects and products basically. That is kind of mainly what you see in, for example, life science. Then it's basically part of building their own portfolio of new products, because they think a lot of that will come from small biotech companies and stuff like that. And then, as you're saying, all the way down to say, well, this is part of changing our innovation culture. So where do you think Maersk is from all the way to, well, we will find the next business area or the next kind of new product or service to kind of the more cultural change within Maersk? Are you kind of playing the whole violin, or are there areas where you're more focused in?
Well, there are definitely areas we're more focused in, but due to our size and scale, we are looking at everything to different degrees. I think there's kind of a common 70-20-10 model that people look at, where 70% of what we're doing and what many corporates do is related to innovating incrementally efficiency optimization stuff on what we do today. We have a lot of assets, as you know, and a lot of machinery and mechanics offshore and even onshore. So a lot of our focus, especially around technology, goes to that and innovating on that. But then the 20%, let's say, is advancing, using what we do today to make kind of top-line growth on our current business. So commercializing things that we do today in new ways and so on. So we do look at that to some extent, but there are certain groups that are more oriented towards that. And then the 10% is kind of whole new venture stuff. I don't know if we necessarily have a 10% focus on that, but it's something that we're looking a lot more at.
Sure.
And still kind of finding our way there, because we've, as you probably know, the history of Maersk, last 10 years or so, we've been focusing in a lot more on our core around transport, logistics, shipping, and then upstream oil and gas. So we've done that, and we're trying to get better and better at that, of course. But now we're looking out to see, okay, and what's next? What are our growth areas? Kind of hopefully and ideally attached to our core, using that in a different way.
Sure. And if you should look at it from the perspective of a startup, what do you think a startup can gain from working closely with Maersk?
Well, that's the thing. We're not good at leveraging it for startups yet, but we want to be better. Is that we have the scale, right? So if you want to test your product, one, we have people, we have assets, we have access to different markets, which is great, but we also have the scale. So if you've tested a minimum viable product and it's proving itself in one way, and now you want to either roll it out wider or manufacture if it's a hardware product, who knows? We have the network and the scale to apply it to very quickly. And we also have a lot of in-house knowledge that is valuable to startups. So we have tons and tons of engineers, and we have legal people, and we have commercial people, and we have just IT and infrastructure and analysts and all kinds of things. So we have people kind of with every different competency somewhere in the world.
Exactly.
And that's something that we could really provide a lot of value to the startups from. It's something we have started to enable, but we can be and will be better at it going forward, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think that you are basically too modest. I think that if you look at the corporation like Maersk in total, you probably have all the skills and the competences and the resources and stuff like that that a startup could need in of course in the areas that Maersk is operating. So from my perspective, kind of the whole relationship between large corporations and startups is kind of the most interesting kind of development I've seen in the startup world for the last kind of 5-10 years. So the utilization of kind of the resources that you have could be extremely tremendous, at least from the perspective of a startup.
Yeah, but I think that's also the hard part, right? Because
Exactly.
when in Maersk we're approximately 80,000 people,
Exactly.
right? In over 100 countries, and of course teams of various sizes in each country, but how do you leverage the right ones, especially since technology and startups are really a global ecosystem now, right? They move to where their market is, and then if they get an opportunity somewhere else, they go and they expand very quickly.
Exactly.
And that's something that we want to nurture and support. But we have the global coverage, but not the interconnectivity
No, of course not.
fully worked out yet.
No, of course not. I haven't seen any large corporation figure that out entirely. But how do you work with your kind of the internal motivation towards working with startups? Because everyone in Maersk and any kind of large corporation is of course extremely busy running their department and running their kind of special obligations and stuff like that. So how do you make, one thing is basically make room for that, and the other thing is of course in a large corporation. So how do you motivate people in order to say, well, this is actually interesting to work with startups? So what be kind of the ideas and thinking around that?
Well, there's kind of two sides to that one, because on one hand we have a lot of really kind of, let's call it nerdy and excited people about technology. So we have a lot of people in Maersk who are super excited about using startups, which is great. But because we don't have kind of an approach to how, and we have a very different working culture, working speed, bureaucratic process, and so on to what the startups are used to, we have a lot of people super excited and going out and initiating things before maybe they know actually how to handle it or have kind of a method to support that being a fruitful relationship, which can be dangerous if, goes wrong. And then on the other side, we have a lot of brilliant engineers and specialists in the company who are now seeing startups come that can do things that either complement what they do, which is great, but also do things with technology that they are threatened by. It may not even be a threat. It may just be a lack of understanding what the technology space is or the application space. But when it's something new and it's hitting to kind of your home, it can be actually very threatening emotionally, especially if you haven't been part of the dialogue and understand what's the intention with this. And that's also very difficult when there are so many startups and Maersk's such a big company. We've had instances where we've had great ideas come in through startups and then find out that there was a team already working in that space. Not on the same idea, of course, but their first reaction was, is this a team coming from the outside to replace us or not? And what is the intention in this? And the issue was that there was no intention towards this team at first because it was somewhere else in the company and we weren't even aware of what they were working on. So knowing how to handle these kind of emotionally uncomfortable situations, it's actually more about human psychology than it is about organizational design.
Yeah, exactly. So if you kind of look 5 years ahead and say, well, now we've been through this experience and stuff like that. So how do you think that you will measure success? Because kind of one of my biggest fear in this market, and as I said, I think it's a kind of a new thing and a kind of a really beneficial thing for the whole startup community that large corporations are kind of involving themselves similar to Maersk. But I have this fear that it ends up being a little bit like the corporate venturing in the 80s in Denmark. So everyone did it, and now everyone is not doing it anymore because, well, it didn't work quite as they thought. So how do you want to measure success in working with startups? Is there any criteria at all, or any matrix that you are looking at?
Oof. That's a difficult question because what we've found is it really depends a lot on what you're trying to do with the startup. But kind of overarching creates the measurements and KPIs that you have for it, right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, we started the same place as most corporates years ago with measuring, okay, how many new ideas have we filtered out, right? But we've discovered that isn't a very useful metric, of course. You want ideas, but it's less relevant to measure, okay, how many upfront did you have and how do you define an idea versus a project and all that. So it'll take us some time to really figure out. Right now, luckily, especially for this last year with the project, we've been mostly measured on, okay, how much learning have we taken in? And have we been able to take decisions in a more confident direction on how we should move forward? So that's been successful and that's been very positively recognized, which I feel is a good sign because anytime learning, when we start to move towards the whole failure, supportive culture and all that, is the most important thing to measure, but it's also the hardest tangibly. So people can recognize that it's valuable, at least we're starting somewhere. But again, because of the scale of who we are, the more and more startups I feel that we start to see being, it's got supplier-vendor relationships in addition to our current strategic suppliers, or that we can do kind of three-party partnerships around, would be a measure. So if you see it increasing, one definite measure is reduced bureaucracy. So this amount of time it takes to agree a reasonable agreement or a contract and payment terms. As you know, a lot of times if there's a startup who's developing something for you, often you'll pay 50% up front and 50% at the end so that there's some running money for basic costs and so on. And if you're doing a 2-month project, then some of the corporate payment terms and so on that we're used to doing of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days doesn't work for the upfront half, right? So that even something as simple as that will actually take time in a company like ours to make sure that we have a really effective process for, while still being kind of reliable and trustworthy, because we don't want to just pay anyone, right?
No,
we have to, of course, have controls and make sure that we have trusted suppliers and so on.
Sure.
So it's efficiency of process, quantity of projects that we're going through. I think for the first few years, quantity of projects. Last few years, quantity of successful implementations, of course. Both are important all the way along, but we're going to have to do some learning cases, I think, up front. There's one that I don't know how to measure, but it's important measurement, is to see kind of traction in management and the understanding of not only how to work with startups and how they're different from us, but the value they can bring and also the value that Maersk can bring, because we're used to very transactional relationships. But as we talked about earlier, Maersk has knowledge, we have market access, we have test ability of products and so on. So Maersk has a lot to offer beside just investment or buying something.
Sure,
but we haven't kind of commercialized that value in a sense that we know, okay, you could have 20 hours of an engineer's experience on your team in exchange for some licenses or who knows what, right? And it's happening in one-off cases. There are people around Maersk who've been doing this for a while, just not in a structured kind of corporate coordinated way. Not saying it has to be corporate coordinated either. So there are good learnings, but there are also ones where it hasn't worked out just because people didn't know how to handle this different kind of relationship.
Exactly.
So that's something that we're trying to work on and figure out.
So if you go back and kind of say, well, the kind of the innovation effort that is done internally through research and development and also kind of specific projects, do you have a kind of a way of measuring success in that? Is that kind of what comes to market, and or is there kind of any return on investment perspective on kind of your own internal projects that you have developed?
Yeah, it depends on project to project again, but a lot of the technology-oriented projects we have to put a return on investment or something that, depending on what is the value add or safety improvement, because obviously safety is a big objective of ours to make sure everything is as safe as possible. So that one's a little harder to measure concretely in financial return.
Yeah, exactly.
But for example, if it reduces fuel expenditure, for example, or more efficient voyage planning of our vessels, or port logistics, things like that. Anything that these are the type of projects we're looking at, and then we have different solutions, technology or otherwise, that we're applying to these problems. So those would be quite calculable, because you know, okay, how much does 10 minutes less at a port cost?
Absolutely.
So those have very concrete measurements.
Okay. And the reason why I'm asking that is kind of probably twofold. One is kind of one of the things that really interests me is what you started out with saying, well, the whole kind of learning part. So how do you learn efficient through startup? and is that basically more efficient than learning through whatever other types of kind of learning channels that you can have? You could take courses in digital world or whatever. You could hire universities and stuff like that. So I think there's an interesting part about say, well, can you through startup kind of in specific areas kind of build a kind of insights and knowledge that make you able at kind of doing better decision along the way in those areas. But I'm also kind of convinced that the kind of the model of how you measure it and how you figure out whether it works is kind of yet to be invented in somehow. And the second reason why is kind of say, well, if you were to invest in this area, I still have a kind of a feeling that it should be kind of comparable to doing it internally, because as a company there's a little bit of opportunity cost here. So you could either, I'm not saying you should probably do both, but you could either invest kind of more heavily in internal kind of innovation and research departments and stuff like that, or you can kind of invest more heavily in external. And of course there needs to be a balance, but to some extent those two things should be comparable. Say what kind of, where do we have the biggest return on investment? But maybe I'm totally off here.
No, but I think what's missing is maybe some layers of complexity because, I mean, you know about ambidextrous organizations, right?
Yeah.
So you have the right hand operating, running things, and then the left hand looking at the new opportunities.
Sure.
And it's the same here in that a lot of things will be better done in-house because we have large technical organizations, we have a big analytics team, we have lots of engineers and naval architects and so on. So we have people who know both the assets and the business as well as kind of the operating context and so on.
Yeah.
So they are well equipped in many cases to do a lot of the projects, but rarely do we do them alone, right? It's either with OEMs or with academia or other partners.
Yeah.
So it is a decision case by case, I think. If we have a business challenge that comes up, a technical problem we want to solve or something we want to innovate on, new opportunity, it will be a discussion. Okay, is there a team inside Maersk fit to do this?
Yeah.
Then, okay. We don't have to do everything outside, right?
No,
And we shouldn't.
No.
But it also is the more kind of far away from our current approach or our current business or the less familiar we are with new technology, the more value we probably would get from early experimentation with the startups, right?
Yeah.
So I think it was a leading question because I know that you know the
I'm
value.
always doing leading questions.
Like what my favorite quote right now is from Julius Caesar, which is experience is the teacher of all things, right?
Yeah.
And so when you talk about learning and how do you value learning and is learning the same by experimenting with startups versus academia or going to a course or doing something online, things like that. Everyone has different learning styles, of course, but as an organization, I think that the fastest way to learn is quick experimentation.
Yeah.
The danger in that is organizations like Maersk can be kind of unsupportive of failure in a misunderstanding of how you define what failure is.
Yeah.
So if something fails, it doesn't necessarily mean you should stop doing that thing.
No.
It should be, okay, why did it fail?
Yeah.
And then you should evaluate, well, do we stop? Or is it actually something we need to pivot? Or should it be combined with something else, right? It's never as simple as, oh, it failed, just stop.
Yeah. No.
Don't look at why, just ignore it, right? But that can be the danger in a fast-paced operational environment where you need to kind of move on to a solution that works.
Exactly.
And it's really about a thinking approach.
Yeah. I totally agree, because I think that kind of what sometimes kind of make me a little bit hesitant in kind of the whole collaboration between startups is that if you only look at it from the perspective of say, well, we will find the next big thing, right? That basically turns our business over. And I'm looking at the yearly revenue in Maersk and say, well, how many startups out there is basically able at all moving digits within your organization? There's not a lot, basically, and the few there are, well, how do we build a relationship? So I actually think that we need to understand it differently, and probably, as you're saying, from a kind of a learning perspective. But of course, this is also where it gets difficult, right? Because if you are a manager in a large corporation, and say, well, you also have shareholders and other people looking at the results that you create. You say, well, we will learn in the long run. It's like, yeah, come on, guys.
I don't think it's good enough to just say we'll learn in the long run. No. It's okay if we say we'll learn in the short run and then be able to do X. That's okay. And of course we will learn in the long run, right? But that isn't really a safe target in and of itself right now. You need to have what's going to happen in between.
Yeah, exactly. So you need to transform kind of the short-term learnings into kind of actual results at a certain point in time.
Exactly, and results don't have to necessarily be financial up front, right? But you have to be able to see it leading to something. Exactly. It has to contribute in some way to the company's growth, to return to the shareholders, environmental friendliness. We have the whole emissions cap coming in 2020, which is great because then we can be much more sustainable. We already have been trying, and now we're really happy to have that as a driver as well, right? So as long as there's some objective we're working towards and you can see progress, then that's what matters most.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you very much for being here.
Good.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Peter.